Renowned journalist and author Ariana Huffington's latest venture is being co-chair of the nonprofit organization Parents in Charge. The mission? Helping parents of all ethnic backgrounds give their children a quality education. Join me as I talk with Ariana Huffington and get an inside look into Ariana's view on how we can improve our children of the future.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gail Gross. I'm delighted you could join me today. My guest is a nationally syndicated columnist, a radio show host, best-selling author, and political commentator, Ariana Huffington. She is a well-respected journalist and opinion maker. She is also a mother of two beautiful daughters, Christina and Isabella. Her newest project is Parents in Charge. She is the co-chair of this nonpartisan group, dedicated to educating us about the real problems and the real possibilities in education. Today she is here to talk about several issues, including her work with Parents in Charge. Ariana, welcome.
Thank you, Gail.
I wanted to start at the beginning and talk about the fact that you were born in Greece, educated in England at Cambridge, where you received an MA in economics, and then wrote your first book, The Female Woman. Tell us about that.
Well, it was a complete coincidence because I was ready to go to Harvard to do a postgraduate degree at the Kennedy School when an English publisher who had actually published Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, wrote to me and asked me if I would write a book on the views I had expressed in a debate at the Cambridge Union. And I wrote back and I said, I can't write. And he wrote back and he said, can you have lunch? And we had lunch and he offered to subsidize me modestly for a year. And he said, at the end of that, you'll either prove that you can't write and I will have lost a few £1,000, or I will publish your first book. And that's what happened. My first book was published when I was 23. And it was basically looking at the role of women at the time and saying we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That yes, of course, women should have equal rights, equal pay, but at the same time, we should show equal respect for the woman who chooses to be a mother and respect that role and respect that choice. At the time it was controversial, but a few years later Betty Friedan wrote The Second Stage, which more or less said the same thing.
And you've moved right into your own life in just that way. Your current book, How to Overthrow the Government. That's quite a title, and you've become an activist. Tell us about this book, which really looks at corruption and political issues.
Well, the book looks at how we've become two nations. One nation prospering, even in these harder times, and one nation left behind without health care insurance, with dysfunctional schools, without really the opportunity to become one nation, indivisible under God, which was the promise of America. So I look at how did that happen. I look at the what Teddy Roosevelt actually called the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt government, the campaign contributions and the impact they have on policy, the lobbyists and the impact they have on policy, until we see a system where the public interest does not come first, special interests come first. And now, when we have all these bankruptcies, Enron and Global Crossing and a lot of other less publicized bankruptcies, we see how we were really asleep at the switch. We allowed things to happen without oversight because a lot of these CEOs, a lot of these companies had such a glow of power around them that everybody felt they could do no wrong. So that the institutions that were there to oversee them, the congressional committees, even the financial journalists, somehow did not do their job. And that has to change because it's undermining democracy, it's undermining our trust in the system, and it's leading to millions of people not even bothering to vote in our elections. It's one of the tragedies of our system that probably in November, when the congressional election will be happening, we'll see about a 35% turnout.
Yes, and here we have such seduction, contributions, campaign contributions, even journalists being paid for various and sundry things. So with such seduction, what is your view? What plan can you bring forward to make a difference?
Well, what I argue in the book is that we need to stoke the fires of public outrage. We need people to basically say no more. Because politicians only understand punishment. And if they don't think they're going to be punished, they're going to continue along their merry way. And there is a very direct quid pro quo, whatever they say, between contributions and public policy. You see it again and again.
So then if you enter this domain of outrage and show your vote by not voting for people who we know take these contributions, that can make a difference.
But that's not enough. I think that's too passive, simply not voting. The AIDS activists who demonstrated at Al Gore's rallies during the last presidential race showed exactly how you change public policy. There are only 200 of them most of the time, but they demonstrated in a way that made it so politically embarrassing for him to continue with the U.S. policy when it came to AIDS in South Africa. You see, basically the U.S. had supported the pharmaceutical industry and we were on the side of the pharmaceutical companies in literally suing the South African government over the allowing of the importation of generic AIDS drugs or the manufacturing of generic AIDS drugs, since they could clearly not afford to pay the astronomical prices that it costs for these AIDS drugs here. So we sided with them in the middle of an epidemic. It's one of the great tragic public policy decisions. And it was not until these AIDS activists demonstrated that Al Gore was really forced to begin to change public policy. And it took a while, but without that really civil rights, civil disobedience action, who knows where we would still be.
And you followed that role when you created your shadow conventions, which were fantastic, and they really they were parallel to each of the conventions, Republican and Democratic, for president, and you brought up the issues and addressed the possibilities that the two parties wouldn't touch.
Well, that was the goal of the shadow conventions. That's why we called them shadow conventions. To really address three key issues that neither party was seriously addressing at its convention. One was campaign finance reform.
Yes. You had McCain there, as a matter of fact.
John McCain was amazing. He opened our Philadelphia convention, and he was very unpopular within the Republican Party for doing that, but he did that, and I will always be grateful to him for it. And the other issue was the growing discrepancies in income, what I said earlier about us becoming two nations, the growing inequalities. And the third was the failed war on drugs, and how basically we have ended up having 500,000 people in jail at the moment for non-violent drug offenses. I believe it's in that area that we made the most difference, because we had many speakers from the Congressional Black Caucus, and Congressman John Conyers, for example, offered to pass legislation that would deal with some of these discrepancies in, say, the sentencing when it comes to powder versus crack cocaine, all these very racist parts of our laws, which mean that disproportionate numbers of African Americans are now in jail for drug offenses.
For drug offenses that celebrities might use as social drugs and never
end up in jail,
ever pay any cost. So fascinating. I remember seeing families at the Shadow Convention, broken families, that came and said, you took my father, you took my mother, and grandparents were raising children, and kids were being put in foster care simply for marijuana charges. I mean, it was amazing.
Yes, what we did at the Philadelphia Convention, where you're at, was to literally bus members of the families of the people who were in jail, children especially, to demonstrate the incredible cost in human lives for generations really to come too. When you just take the parents away, you put them in jail for non-violent drug offenses, you don't give them treatment. So even when they come out of jail, they are still not fit to be parents.
So fascinating.
And that's why here in California, where we passed Prop 36 to move from incarceration to treatment, it's making a big difference. And that has to be a national public policy change.
And it's so much in the way we view drugs, Ariana, isn't it? I mean, socially, a person can use drugs. Medically, we overdrug our children. You've been writing quite a bit about Prozac and Ritalin. Not that you don't suggest that if people need it, certainly you say yes. If a doctor says you need it, take it. But on the other hand, 6 million kids are on drugs, on prescription drugs. Many times these drugs are being used for remediation, for discipline, and you've been really very vocal in your opinions. Talk to us about that a bit.
Well, I feel it's a very schizophrenic attitude towards drugs. We are over-drugging our children. We give Ritalin and Prozac very often for behavioral reasons. And I believe that this drug should not be given to any child without a proper psychoanalytic, psychiatric evaluation.
By a neurologist or psychiatrist,
Exactly.
someone really equipped to make that
And
diagnosis.
after proper, full evaluation of the child. Instead, they're just being given at the drop of the hat. And as a result, we now have a lot of children who don't know how to navigate their emotions except when they are on some kind of drug. And as a result, there are studies that have been done out of Berkeley that show that children that have been on Ritalin for long periods of time move on.
That's right. Move more quickly
cocaine.
into hard drugs because they are already experiencing mood alteration based on medication, and it makes them very vulnerable then to hard drugs in their teenage years. And I want to just reiterate that, of course, you always feel that if the child really needs the medication, that's another story.
Absolutely. It just has to be clearly established that the child needs it.
And we do know also that there's a long-term issue with Ritalin and with Prozac, that these operate similar to diet pills and can thin out the cell wall, which makes people in their 40s who have been on Ritalin and been on Prozac in some cases more vulnerable to strokes.
And what I'm saying, and the reason I'm focusing on children, is that we don't have enough studies about the impact of these drugs on a growing brain.
Right.
So that's why my main preoccupation is with children. Once you're an adult, you do what you do. But when you're a child, we all have a responsibility as a society to do what's best for them.
Yes.
And we just don't have enough evidence to show that these drugs are safe in the long term.
Yes. And so that moves me into educating parents to be involved, to be knowledgeable, to make themselves aware of what their roles are, what they can do. And that has a lot to do with your new program that you're involved with.
Parents in Charge was founded by Teddy Forstman, who had first gotten involved by founding the Children's Scholarship Fund with John Walton. And they gave $200 million worth of scholarships to inner city kids. And it was just an amazing education for everybody involved because they saw the level of despair. For 44,000 scholarships, they had 1,250,000 qualified applicants. And to be a qualified applicant, you had to be making about $19,000 a year and be willing to give $1,000 of your own meager resources a year toward your child's scholarship. And such is the level of despair among low-income parents that so many of them were willing to do that. And so many of them obviously were left disappointed because there are only 44,000 scholarships given by lottery. So that's what prompted Teddy Forstman to found Parents in Charge, which is really an advocacy group, an educational group intended to educate the public about the real crisis and the real possibilities in education reform, and to organize parents, especially low-income parents, to get involved in bringing about these changes. Because public education is a fundamental right in this country, and now we're depriving millions of children of their right to a quality public education, which often is the only opportunity they have to have a productive life. And what has happened is that we are confusing the faith with the church. You know, the faith is in public education. The church is the current way public schools are operating. And there is nothing anywhere that says that the government should also provide the education. The government has to pay for it. What we are arguing is that we need to bring two principles to bear. One is equity, and the other is choice.
What do you say to parents who say this is just a way to segregate or to make a separate but equal education, that it'll make a homogenized group, putting people in a certain area, in a certain school? What do you say to parents who say that?
Well, first of all, we wouldn't put people anywhere. We want parents to choose where they put their children.
Yes.
Second, as Jonathan Kozol has written, we now have an incredibly segregated system. If you go to South Bronx, it's hard to find any whites in the schools there. Jonathan Kozol has written really
quite a bit. Savage Inequalities, Amazing Grace, and so forth. All about Savage Inequalities was really all about that. And I think we should tell our viewers that part of how we pay for public education is by taxes, and those taxes have to do with where we live. So if you live in a poor area, the unequitable taxes make for unequitable schools. There is a Robin Hood program written by Jonathan, in fact, where you subsidize by $60,000 these unequitable schools, but it never meets the measure of a Fifth Ward in the Bronx and a wonderful area in a white neighborhood, for example.
The system has been flawed from its inception. If you base the funding of education on property taxes, it's never going to be equitable.
Right.
So what we are proposing is that we equalize funding between urban and suburban districts, and that then this full amount, this full per pupil funding, goes to the parents, not obviously directly, but is available to them to assign to any school accredited by the government. So the schools have to be accredited, which means that they have to meet all the civil rights discrimination laws and regulations, and the standards, exactly. But at the same time, the parents then are given the opportunity that affluent parents have to choose which school is the best for their child. Now this right only means anything if there are schools to choose from.
Yes.
And at the moment there simply aren't.
Exactly.
And that's why we are encouraging the creation of many schools, many alternative providers. You know, right now we have a lot of good charter schools, but nowhere near enough. And these schools were created by amazing educational entrepreneurs. And against all odds, they've been able to create schools that disprove everything that has been said about how low-income children cannot learn, children from single-parent homes.
KIPP Academy is a perfect example.
KIPP Academy here in Los Angeles, the accelerated school, the North Star Academy in New Jersey. We're doing a documentary about all these amazing providers and what they have been able to do. But we need to have a system that has thousands of these providers, not just a few exceptional jewels, but an enormous amount of opportunities.
What do you see that doing, and this is the other argument, to the public school population? When you take money from a system that we call public school and put it into charters like this and privatize education, what happens to that public school system?
Well, first of all, we are asking people to look again at what is a public school system. We're asking people to think outside the box. We are claiming that what makes public education public is that the public pays for it through the government, not that the government provides it.
Yes.
Think of healthcare. Even my most liberal friends think there's nothing higher, nothing better than a single-payer healthcare system, right? Nobody's saying that the government should provide the healthcare.
Exactly.
But that the government should pay for it.
Exactly.
So why are we saying here that public education is not public if the government is not providing it? Is Jonathan Williams' school here any less public than a good public school? So that's really our philosophical argument.
And it's a strong one.
I think it's really the only argument to make if we want to really strengthen public education. Instead of allowing millions of children basically to be trapped in dysfunctional schools, while people who are defending the current system are taking their kids out of those schools.
Exactly. Well, and that's another thing. You know, we see so many politicians, presidents and the like, taking their children and putting them into the private sector, in private schools, never mind public schools.
Exactly.
So that's exactly right. So how does this all fit in with President Bush's Leave No Child Behind?
Well, this bill that has now become the law of the land on education is unfortunately not going to solve any of the major problems. It's going to cost $26 billion. It's been embraced by Teddy Kennedy and the president. And it's all in the rhetoric. For example, one of the centerpieces of the bill is that parents will be able to choose an alternative school if their child has been in a failing school for 2 consecutive years. But there are no alternative schools to go to. Here in Los Angeles, schools are so overcrowded that we need 85 new schools just to accommodate the children currently in the system.
You have a school here with a population of over 5,000. I mean, that's amazing, like a city.
Exactly. So we need to be realistic when we promise people things that we cannot deliver. And unfortunately, with the political establishment, now they think they've done education, right? And they can move on to something else. And the crisis in education is something which we're going to pay for very dearly in the years to come if we don't do something about right now. Because unfortunately, there is a clear connection between illiteracy and entering the criminal justice system.
Huge.
50% of people in jail cannot read.
Exactly.
So if we graduate children who cannot read, worse, if children drop out of school as they're increasingly doing and cannot get a job, the chances of them basically entering a life of crime in one form or another are so great.
Great. And there's a huge correlation between dropouts and large schools, in fact. You know, the kids in large classes in high school, there is this variable about large classes and dropping out. It's very interesting.
Absolutely. But again, we cannot just emphasize one thing, like smaller class size or school uniform
or testing.
You know, we always get sort of obsessed with one particular incremental change, and what Parents in Charge is suggesting is a fundamental reform of the whole system.
It's the holistic approach.
Exactly, and not just one particular reform. Because the reality is that sometimes you can have a large classroom, and if you have 2 fabulous teachers, you can have great results. So we have to allow individual schools to make up their own rules within certain boundaries, to be able to hire and fire teachers. It is absurd not to be able to fire bad teachers. It is truly absurd and should no longer be allowed. That's what we want to get parents to say. This cannot continue. It's affecting our children. And that's why we want to educate parents, empower them, and say, go out there and tell politicians you're not going to put up with that.
What a wonderful idea. I mean, really, and that leads me to your new book, the book in the oven, so to speak, about leadership. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, it's a perfect segue because the book is called The Leader in the Mirror, Redefining Leadership for the 21st Century. And I'm calling it The Leader in the Mirror because I think a lot of us have given up on political leadership. I mean, yes, the President has done a great job in conducting the war, but there are many domestic crises that remain unaddressed. And when it comes to those crises, we need each one of us to play a leadership role. We need to be leaders in our communities. We need to be leaders when it comes to public policy. We need to find what our own passion is.
Yes.
And it's going to be different for each one of us. And say that we're going to do something about that, because I'm convinced, Gail, that we'll never find happiness until we do something beyond our own lives.
Yes.
The people who try to find happiness simply by having more money or more sex or more possessions, if they're lucky, end up at the Betty Ford clinic, you know.
If that were the answer, they'd all be happy, and we know they're not. You're right. It's very true. Contribution and service, we know that's the key. And it's a time of I think, an important time of history where we really can't afford the digital divide. We really can't afford immorality. We have to look at our children and what we're guiding them to and how we're teaching them, and take the responsibility to parent.
I know, and that's certainly in my life that's been a huge part, because my daughters are now 10 and 12, and I feel they need more of me now than they needed when they were 10 and 12 months old.
Exactly.
and trying to instill that sense of service in them. I mean, one of the things I'm doing with the Points of Light Foundation is encouraging families to volunteer together.
Yes.
Because if we can bring up our children from an early age to make that part of their lives, to volunteer the way they're used to going to the movies or going to the park or going to Disneyland, then it will be second nature to them when they're older.
That's right. It'll shape them. I tell parents always, be what you want to see and model for your children how they should be, because that's what they'll end up doing in their own lives. You're so right. I have a defining question that I always end our interviews with. What was the defining moment in your life? I know I've taken one of them away, so another one.
Really, the defining moment was back when I was 23 years old, and I was going around the world promoting my first book.
Yes.
And suddenly, at 23, I had a lot of the things that I thought would take me a lifetime to achieve. Having come from a family that had no money and having gotten a scholarship to Cambridge, I thought it would take me, a long time to have financial independence and have a career. And suddenly I had those things at 23, and I had a midlife crisis. So I found myself asking the Peggy Lee question, is that all there is? And that's really what started me on my own search, on my own spiritual search, to understand more deeply what life is about. And
Yes.
being Greek, I knew from my mother that Socrates had said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And so that process of self-examination was something that started in my 20s, and definitely that was the defining moment.
What a fascinating story. It's I who really know you so well, know that really defined how you really organized your life from evermore as an activist and a contributor to society, and someone who had such great integrity that no matter what the cost, you always walked that line of service to others.
Well, I feel that life is often about course correcting. We all make mistakes. We all take the wrong paths. It's never about perfection. And it's never about getting it right all the time. For me, it's increasingly about how quickly do I get back on the right path. And how quickly do we realize that I'm off course? After all, pilots know that most of the time airplanes are off course, but they have a perfect course-correcting mechanism.
And that inner cue gets better and better, doesn't it, as we go along?
And the more we listen to it, the stronger it gets. I think the more I listen to my own intuition, the more I remember my dreams and pay attention to them, the more in tune I am with what's happening in my life. It's hard, especially for people who are very cerebral, as I am, to trust other sources of knowledge. I used to be so much in my head that if I woke up one morning and felt happy, but I couldn't think why I was happy, I would cancel it. So I think a lot of it has to do with just trusting that we're being given information all the time from other sources. Our body, how sometimes we react to people just like that, and we don't know why. Trust that. It doesn't mean act on it. Trust enough to investigate it.
I love that. When Pandora opened that box and let out all the evils of the world, what stayed behind was hope. With hope and vision, we can change the world. Thank you, Ariana, for with your vision, you have given us some hope. I'm Dr. Gail Gross. Thanks for joining me.